Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. It's a big news day, which means it's unfortunate I haven't got a co-host today, but I have got two big expert guests. First, I'll be speaking to Martin Forde KC about Labour's pretty appalling treatment of Diane Abbott. That's Martin Forde of the Forde Report, so he really is the person to speak to on this story. I then got an interview with Andrew Feinstein about the South African elections. Now, you might have heard about Andrew recently. He's the person standing against Keir Starmer in his constituency, but he's also a former member of the African National Congress. So he has lots of brilliant insights about what is set to be a very significant election. It's the first time where in 30 years where the ANC is set to lose their majority. I'll also be discussing a pretty phenomenal scoop from The Guardian. They've revealed that Israel has been spying, hacking, and intimidating the International Criminal Court for decades. Today's main election story hasn't been about a policy proposal, but rather an individual, namely Diane Abbott. And it's all been a bit of a mess. It all follows Labour's announcement yesterday that Britain's first black female MP would be readmitted to the party and have the Labour whip reinstated. But that announcement went alongside a briefing to the Times with worse news for the Hackney North MP. This was the tweet from Stephen Swinford. Diane Abbott will not be allowed to stand as a Labour candidate in the general election, bringing an end to her 37-year career in Parliament. There are no circumstances in which she will stand under the Labour banner on July the 4th. Senior aides to Starmer have held discussions about restoring her to the Labour whip before election to allow her to leave politics with dignity. This morning, Diane Abbott confirmed to a BBC journalist that she had been blocked from standing. However, then a couple of hours later, she tweeted this: "Naturally, I am delighted to have the Labour whip restored and to be a member of the PLP. Thank you to all of those who supported me along the way. I will be campaigning for a Labour victory, but I am very dismayed that numerous reports suggest I have been barred as a candidate." So that then seems to be a suggestion counter to the confirmation to the BBC. She's dismayed that numerous reports suggest I have been barred as a candidate. Now, you might think that means she hasn't been barred as a candidate. And that's the claim that was made by Keir Starmer when he was interviewed today.
No decision has been taken to bar Diane Abbott. The process that we were going through ended with the restoration of the whip the other day. So she's a member of the Parliamentary Labour Party. And no decision has been taken barring her.
So all somewhat confusing. Is she being barred? Is she not being barred? Clearly, I think on one level, what Starmer said is formally true there. Any official decision about approving candidates will be made at a meeting by Labour's NEC next week. What's not mentioned there is that the NEC are likely to rubber stamp the preferences of the party leadership, and nearly all political journalists are suggesting that Keir Starmer and his team made up their minds a long time ago. They did not want Diane Abbott to be a Labour MP, so they won't let her restand. So what's been going on over the past 24 hours? It all does seem fairly messy. Well, ITV's Robert Peston tweeted this today. Diane Abbott received a private letter from the Labour chief whip yesterday telling her that she was back in the parliamentary party. Abbott believed that that would be the precursor to her own announcement that she would be retiring, to be accompanied by a flurry of tributes for her service from Starmer and others. The elegant departure had been under negotiations for weeks, which is why she felt badly let down when the Times was briefed that she had been banned from running in this election. All she wanted, I understand, was the dignity of being able to say she was choosing to stand down. This looks like a mess that could have been avoided. So according to Peston's theory, which sounds very plausible, a carefully choreographed exit for Diane Abbott had been forestalled by trigger-happy advisors briefing the story to the Murdoch press. Now, you might think, what a cock-up. How did they manage to do that? They had it all planned out, and then someone messed up by letting slip to the Murdoch press that actually Diane Abbott was being blocked. I think just as likely, probably more likely, this was the result of outright vindictiveness by people close to Keir Starmer, right? We know people on the Labour right have often absolutely revelled in humiliating Britain's first black female MP. It seems that this was their last opportunity to stick the knife in, right? Something they just couldn't resist. And you've got to see sort of from this account from Robert Peston, it actually seems like Diane Abbott was being remarkably cooperative. She'd been treated completely appallingly. And she's saying, okay, well, I just want to go out with dignity. I'm not going to stand as an independent. I'm not going to do what Jeremy Corbyn is doing. By the way, I support what Jeremy Corbyn is doing, but it's more awkward for Keir Starmer than if Diane Abbott did it. Diane Abbott just said, I just want to retire with some dignity, give me back the whip, then I'll announce I'm not standing. And then you had these presumably rabid right-wingers near Keir Starmer who said, oh, we're not going to let her make the announcement for herself. Let's brief the Murdoch press that actually she's being banned. Won't that be humiliating? Right? That seems to have been what's happened, and it's been a very bad news day for the Labour Party, and lots of people are rightly outraged at the treatment of, I don't want to call her a trailblazing MP, because that's what Keir Starmer has told all of his front benchers to go out and say on the news channels. It does seem a little bit duplicitous. Oh, she's so trailblazing, but we're also not going to let her stand, and we're going to brief in private that, she's a terrible person. Whatever the reason for that briefing, it came after another embarrassing revelation about Labour's handling of this case. For months, when asked about Diane Abbott's future, Starmer and others have claimed there was a disciplinary process underway, and so they couldn't possibly comment. This was an independent process. They shouldn't intervene in it. However, yesterday, Newsnight revealed that that process had actually ended months ago. Victoria Derbyshire grilled Shadow Treasury Minister James Murray on that fact.
Sir Keir Starmer told the BBC on Friday, Diane Abbott is going through and being part of and getting to the end of a disciplinary process. That process has been in the hands of the Chief Whip since February, March. Who does the Chief Whip report to?
Well, the Chief Whip obviously works with the leader of the Labour Party, but it's not a process that I have any inside knowledge on. And, I think it's really... But
you must have asked the question before you came on Newsnight tonight.
Yes, but I don't know the answer to it because I don't have any insight into that process.
Did you not say, what's our line? What are we saying tonight?
Well, I obviously spoke to the press office about me coming on to the show tonight.
What did they tell you to say?
They didn't tell. They told me what we know has happened, which is that the whip has been restored. But this process is not one which is discussed within the Labour Party because it is at arm's length. It is something that MPs like myself have no connection with and no involvement in.
It's
and
not
no
at arm's length
on.
from the leadership and hasn't been since February, when Diane Abbott completed her anti-Semitism course. It's been in the hands of the Chief Whip, who reports to Sir Keir Starmer. Sir Keir Starmer has complete authority over the Chief Whip.
I mean, that was effective interviewing from Victoria Derbyshire there. And it really does link to, what's been going on over the past few months, which is Keir Starmer or anyone on the front bench is asked about this. And they say, well, this isn't a political matter. This is a disciplinary matter. And therefore, we couldn't possibly comment on it. That would be immoral, not just awkward for us to comment on it. It would be immoral. What we learn now is the disciplinary independent process. Now, how independent that may or may not be, you can decide. But it's formally an independent process. That was over months ago. The whip, whether or not a person is suspended from the political party, that's down to HQ and whatever sort of disciplinary unit they have. Whether someone has the Labour whip, that's down to the whip, who is an MP, who works for Keir Starmer. They're appointed by Keir Starmer, and they're only going to sort of tell MPs what Keir Starmer wants them to be told. Right? So this has been a political issue for months, but the Labour Party have essentially been lying to people to say, oh, no, this isn't a political issue. He's now saying, oh, it's a political issue, but I haven't been informed about it. It's as relevant to you as, say, health policy, right? You're a Treasury Minister. That's not completely within your brief, but we're used to seeing front benchers go on television and they give the Labour line. But Labour have sort of said, oh, we don't even need a line for this. That issue about timing came up again this morning, this time with Wes Streeting on LBC.
Just on the independent report, the independent process, people like me have been asking people like you, and indeed Keir Starmer himself, basically for a year, about the timing of that. I asked Keir Starmer about it in March. He told me that process was ongoing. My colleague Nick Ferrari asked Starmer about it on Friday. He said that process was ongoing. It now appears that process concluded in December. Was he misleading us?
I don't know that that's true, and I'm not going to rely on media hearsay.
Well, it would be good for the Labour Party to finally clarify it, wouldn't it, Wes? Because you talk about media hearsay. The reason there's media hearsay is because the Labour Party and people like you are refusing to clarify or saying anything about it and coming onto studios or interviews like this saying, I don't know anything about it. It's your party. Maybe you should know something about it.
Well, I'm glad that among the many things I have to worry about, the Labour Party's disciplinary processes and candidate selection are not my responsibility.
You're an MP that's been serving since 1987, your first black female MP, it's just not of no interest to you or your colleagues?
No, actually, quite the opposite. And I just say on the second point, and I say this with enormous respect for Diane Abbott and everything that she has achieved and the trail that she has blazed as Britain's first black woman MP, despite our political disagreements, and we've had those plenty over the years. I do have enormous respect for Diane Abbott. I do have...
Your party's not
enormous
treating her
respect
with much
for what
respect,
she
though, is it, Lloyd?
has.
So that attempt to project respect to someone who you're essentially stabbing in the back, right? That didn't convince everyone. Journalist Sienna Rogers tweeted this. So she's sharing that clip of where streeting we just showed you. This clip is being circulated among BAME Labour MPs. I'm told one not on left or close to Abbott says, like every other white man, he doesn't get how important Diane is. Real discontent in PLP. Starmer trying to calm it all down by saying decision hasn't been made yet. To discuss Labour's handling of this case, I'm joined by Martin Forde KC. Martin is a barrister who in 2020 was tasked by the Labour Party with investigating the extent of racist, sexist and other discriminatory culture within the organisation. Martin, thank you so much for joining us. In that report, you criticised Labour's sort of disciplinary processes for being opaque and often factionally motivated. It doesn't seem like much has changed, does it?
Apparently not. I mean, the other huge criticism we had was around the length of time it took to resolve complaints. And I said, I think last April, that Diane Abbott had said what she'd said. I wasn't an apologist for what she said. She'd apologised, I think, within an hour or so. And there really wasn't anything to investigate. And I hoped that the process would be concluded very quickly. I can't see any reason why this couldn't have been dealt with within 4 to 6 weeks. We made recommendations around time limits and also a document that could be produced so you'd get consistent outcomes, which would take out factionalism. So you would say, if you say this or like this tweet on one occasion, then that's, you've got long service. And there's mitigation if you've done it repeatedly. Despite warnings, that might be taken as more seriously, so that people kind of had a rough idea of where they might stand in the kind of disciplinary framework. Neither of those things have been done. Excuse me. I wanted to limit the influence of the NEC as well, because the NEC is always factional. They commissioned me to do the report, and obviously they jealously regard their final say. So, I mean, another twist today I've heard about is that the NEC approve or ratify all prospective candidates. So, theoretically, I'm guessing that although Diane Abbott's had the whip restored, the NEC could still decide she wasn't a suitable candidate, which seems to undermine local grassroots democracy. If you've chosen your candidate, your CLP have chosen you, I think it should take something really quite concerning that wasn't revealed to the CLP before the Lotto can undermine that decision.
Yes, I mean
I described it earlier today as shambolic, and that's how it seems, because I'm sure Mr. Streeting, whom you've just featured, wanted to trumpet his NHS ideas, and that got very derailed by people understandably asking about the position of Diane Abbott, because restored last night, then apparently an indication she might not be selected, now more backtracking. I'm very surprised in terms of media management that just isn't a definitive statement being made, along the lines of she is the candidate, she's not barred from standing, and like all other candidates, she's subject to ratification by the NEC, who will have a free vote or something along those lines. Keir Starmer very, very quickly expressed his delight that Angela Rayner had the police action discontinued. And I was a bit surprised that, there wasn't a welcome back to the party having the whip restored yesterday evening.
And your report was both about sort of how disciplinary processes were dealt with. So as you've said there, you thought they should be taken, decisions should be taken more quickly, and it should be more transparent why decisions were being made, so it wouldn't be factional. Your report was also about sort of the handling of issues surrounding race in the party and a potential culture of racism. Now, of course, lots of people are interpreting this decision, So as you say, it's not yet a formal decision, but what seems like a fait accompli that Diane Abbott will not be able to stand as MP through the lens of her being Britain's first female black MP. So how do you think this has been handled in those terms, in terms of sort of Diane Abbott being a very significant figure in this country as a sort of representative of black people?
And frankly, I mean, I think it's been appallingly handled. I mean, whether you share her politics or not, Diane Abbott, I think, for particularly the Afro-Caribbean community, which is my heritage, is a very, very loved and respected figure. And I know you said you didn't want to use the word trailblazer, but definitely, being the first, being principled, talking about matters that are uncomfortable. Yes, she's misspoken on occasions, but the first thing that I found when I was looking at the WhatsApp messages, the subject matter of the report was, just as I described, this visceral disgust towards her, which was, clearly racially motivated. I can't quantify the racism within the Labour Party, but I have no reason to think it's any less than in society in general. Certainly my father, who was a trade unionist, father of chaplain in the NGA, experienced appalling racism within the trade union movement. But I don't think you can say, we're the party of diversity and inclusion and not take these matters seriously and not think about the optics. So I've had a lot of black professional women really triggered by Hester's comments and amazed that the Labour Party didn't kind of wrap its arms around Diane and say, you're welcome back to the fold. I think she gets 10 times the abuse that any other MP gets. And we'll look after you. We'll look after your security. The party's backing you. You're a long-standing, hard-working servant of the party. And I think the other thing in terms of factionalism was that I interviewed probably about 45 people for the report. And the phrase, Labour Party is a broad church, came up over and over and over again. And, one of the peers said to me rather wryly, well, it's a broad church with a very narrow door. And, if the Labour Party want to distance themselves from accusations of factionalism, then it seems to me, there needs to be more transparency about who's making these decisions. If there are deals to be done, is the exchange of emails or letters published? What were the options? What was the likely sanction? What were the aggravating features? What were the mitigating features? How much was your long service taken into account? Did you have testimonials from, other people, as you've said, speaking about their admiration for her? All of that should be part of the package, it seems to me, when it comes to imposing a sanction. And I'm not seeing that kind of a process.
And it's been a couple of years now since you published your report. And I think sort of many on the left of the party especially sort of read that and felt like some of their suspicions were vindicated. There were sort of elements of sort of the internal struggles within the Labour Party that many people felt were ignored by the mainstream media because, it might have been somewhat damaging to the Labour right. That, your report obviously wasn't saying the Labour left all fantastic, the Labour right all, rotters, right? It was a fairly fair and balanced report, but it had a lot of revelations in it that weren't dealt with by the mainstream media as effectively as many people would like them to be. And I think many people are disappointed that it seems to have just been buried, both in terms of media coverage, but then also in terms of Labour actually implementing any of the recommendations which you came up with. Is that an impression you share, that you put all of that time into that report and basically anyone with any power has ignored it?
I think that it would have been nice to have had a chance to talk to the party about, 11 recommendations that they said they couldn't implement, because I felt that some could be bolted on. I also wanted a discussion with them, as I think did Lord Whitty, about retrospective punishment, by which I mean I go to a Labour Against the Witch Hunt meeting in September 2023, and in June 2024, the party say, they're a proscribed organisation. But at the time I went to the meeting, they weren't. And it seemed to both of us a breach of natural justice if you could be retrospectively punished for going to a prescribed organisation that wasn't prescribed at the time. And that's a way of, removing, whole kind of panels and boards and executives once you proscribe an organisation. And I don't think that process is necessarily as transparent as it might be either. In terms of the reaction really was, that was then in the Corbyn era, and this is now kind of under new management. And I think that the Black Caucus of MPs that I've met with, and Black and Asian CLP members, people working at the grassroots, and real enthusiastic activists, just feel that the quotes, and some of them were quite horrendous, that we included in the report from the 1,100 submissions that we got from Labour Party members, were things the party needed to know about. And I guess being a lawyer, I'm quite cautious how I express myself, but I talked about a perception of a hierarchy. It's often been reported as my saying there was a hierarchy. As I've said, these things are very nebulous. You can't send a questionnaire to people saying, are you racist? Do you care more about anti-Semitism than Islamophobia? Because you won't get honest answers. But I wanted the party to be aware that there's real disquiet amongst many of their supporters and activists about how issues around race, misogyny, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, the disabled are seen and perceived by the grassroots. And as I've said, the kind of mission statement, if you like, of the Labour Party is we are the party of diversity and inclusion and social mobility. And the people were expressing to me, and I accept they're a self-selecting group, because you're not going to get the people who are happy writing to you, you'll get the ones that are unhappy. But they wrote in such numbers and in such detail, I thought it was something, we included in allegation 6, that the party needed to be told about, in the hope of having a situation where people felt included and then also felt comfortable agreeing to disagree. So there'd be a bit more kind of respectful debate rather than the kind of dog whistle politics that we seem to be indulging in at the moment.
Martin Forde KC, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really do appreciate it. We're going to go to some breaking news because Labour MP for Kempdown and Peacehaven, Lloyd Russell Moyle, who's been on the show a number of times, he's just tweeted this. So we're going to sort of read out this statement. I've been working day and night since the election was called for success not only in Brighton, Kempdown and Peacehaven, but across Sussex. Yesterday, out of the blue, I received an administrative suspension letter. Someone, who remains anonymous to me, has made what I believe to be a vexatious and politically motivated complaint about my behaviour 8 years ago. This is a false allegation that I dispute totally, and I believe it was designed to disrupt this election. There isn't enough time to defend myself, as these processes within the party take too long, so the party have told me that I will not be eligible to be a candidate at the next election. I'm gutted. I've spent the last decade of my life building one of the best campaigning CLPs in the country. I've been so inspired by everyone pulling together in the last week and excited for the campaign to come. We have an amazing local party, and I am sorry for all of you, most of all. I aim to cooperate with the investigations process to clear my name, but will now take this opportunity to contribute to a public life in different ways under what I hope is a Labour government. I wish Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner and the Labour team the best of luck and hope to be celebrating Labour wins across Sussex and beyond on election night. As this is fairly stunning news, really. I actually tweeted sort of, today might we see more left-wing MPs blocked from standing. Obviously, it's sort of the fact that this election has come somewhat in a rush, doing everything last minute makes it slightly easier for the NEC. Of course, it seems that there has been an allegation here. We can't preempt, the truth of the matter there. But it does seem that sort of to get a letter, basically, a week before the deadline for registering as an MP to say, oh, there's a complaint against you, you can't stand, sorry, doesn't necessarily seem like due process being followed properly here. And, I don't think I need to tell you that I don't think many people are going to have much faith in the non-factional nature of how these decisions are made. So in a party where we saw Andy McDonald get suspended for saying, from the river to the sea, Palestinians and Israelis will live in liberty, that got someone suspended, I think, for around a year. I mean, they've been let back in now. Must have been less than a year because it was after October the 7th, wasn't it? So it must have been, I think it was a month after October the 7th. So it must have been after about 4 months being suspended. Anyway, the disciplinary processes are clearly an absolute mess and are factionally used for factional ends. Of course, we should remain open-minded whenever complaints are made, but it doesn't seem like due process is happening here. And I do wonder if we are going to see more and more left-wing Labour MPs sort of at the last minute. Oops, sorry, there's a reason to not let you stand. As I tweeted today to sort of say, might this happen? And Owen Jones said he thinks this is going to happen. And he was also saying that what will probably happen is at that NEC meeting, they'll block a bunch of people from standing as an MPs. Most of them will be left-wing, but they'll put in a sort of few token right-wingers to say it's non-factional because we also didn't let, this guy and this guy who happen to be on the right but have done some appalling things. So you can say, oh, it's non-factional. We just had to take out our 10 least professional MPs, let's say. Neil Coyle was the one that Owen mentioned, saying they'll block Neil Coyle and then say it can't possibly be factional because he was a right-winger at the same time as blocking loads of left-wing MPs. Again, probably the media will let them get away with it. I'm sure we will have more on this story in the coming days. I want to stick with this story about Diane Abbott and look at another revealing moment in regards to Abbott and Labour's treatment of her. This is from Newsnight last night.
There is an even stronger view amongst supporters of Keir Starmer that Diane Abbott must not stand in this election. So what the Keir Starmer group are saying, allies close to the leader of the Labour Party, is they want dignity for Diane Abbott. One of his allies described her to me as an icon of the Labour movement. But they equally say that Diane Abbott cannot stay because she is, in their view, a reminder of the Jeremy Corbyn era, which they say was an era of failure. And one ally told me that on the doorstep, that incident where Diane Abbott, when she was Shadow Home Secretary in a general election campaign, struggling to sort of explain the numbers behind a policy, they say that comes up on the doorstep and that is damaging.
So a couple of things to say there. How duplicitous, right, to sort of brief, oh, she's an absolute icon, but also she's a complete idiot and everyone knows it. Right? That's essentially what you're saying, right? Bringing up, oh, she did this bad interview in 2017. So, even though she's an icon, she's also a liability. Let's get rid of her, right? It's a very disrespectful way to be briefing about someone. Also, this idea, they remind the electorate of failure, so therefore they can't stand as an MP. Can you imagine if when, Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party and sort of just before the 2017 snap election, he said, you know what? Ed Miliband lost an election. I think he reminds the public of failure. So I'm not going to let him stand to be a Labour MP. Yvette Cooper as well. She was Shadow Home Secretary. She reminds the public of failure. In fact, she was associated with 2 election losses, 2010 and 2015. So, we shouldn't let her stand as an MP either. Right? Can you imagine the outcry there would be? But you can have Nicholas Watt, political editor for Newsnight, go on and say, yeah, they said she's a trailblazer, but people associate her with a bad interview, so we're not going to let her stand as an MP. It's just, where is the due process? I mean, there clearly is no due process, but it's outrageous for it to be said out loud. Well, it's not outrage. I'm glad it was said out loud because that's showing us the reality of what's really going on here. We've got some vox pops for you. Diane Abbott hasn't indicated she'll go the way of Jeremy Corbyn and stand as an independent if she's blocked by Labour, as now seems inevitable. But what would happen if she did? Well, earlier today, Novara Media visited her Hackney North constituency to sense the mood on the street.
How do you feel about the idea of Diane not being allowed to stand for Labour at the general election?
Well, I think it's incredibly unfair. I think she's been someone who's given so much of her life's work to Hackney, and she's really fought for the community and fought for the black community specifically, and I feel like she really represented a lot of black people in the community also. So to treat her in the way that she's been treated is also a knock-on effect on all of us because it tells us that we don't matter.
What's your opinion of Diane Abbott as your local MP?
I love her.
Why is that?
Because she stands up for so many people. Any little protest there is, I don't know, my husband's a librarian and the library workers went on strike and she came to those protests. If there's a children's centre closing down, she's always there supporting local people. And she's been here for forever. She's been here for longer than I've been in Hackney. There's a huge amount of respect for her.
I personally think that her statement was in a bit poor taste. It wasn't very well thought out. I didn't think it was very good. I was a bit I was a bit like, it made me a bit sad. But like ultimately she apologized. She completely took responsibility for it. And then now she's been sitting in limbo for about a year to and it's just not a way to treat one of the most important Labour MPs we have right now, one of the most historic, right? And it's just like, it makes me upset as someone. I've just recently turned 18. I was really looking forward to voting for Diane Abbott. She's one of the MPs that I really look up to. I think it's really important. But I now have just been denied the ability to express how I want to vote, which isn't how a democracy should work.
What a lovely seeming gentleman. For more on what Diane Abbott's constituents make of her, you can check out the rest of that video. We released that on the channel earlier today, so look for that. Let's plug the support link, novaramedia.com/support. If you do want to support our general election coverage, that's where to go. We really do appreciate it. Makes all of this possible. The link is in the description below. 30 years ago, South Africa had its first free and fair election in which the country's black majority could vote. That election was won resoundingly by the African National Congress, who had led the struggle against the apartheid regime. It was an election which saw Nelson Mandela become president after having endured 27 years in prison. And while Mandela would only serve one term, the ANC would go on to dominate South African politics for the next 3 decades. In every election since 1994, the party has won an absolute majority. But today, South Africans go to the polls again, and for the first time, an ANC victory appears to be in doubt. This is part of a France 24 report covering the election.
Long queues outside polling stations as Africa's largest economy heads to the polls. Wednesday's vote is seen as one of South Africa's most pivotal, as support for the ruling African National Congress has begun to wane. According to projections, the ANC may lose its majority for the first time since it came to power in 1994 under Nelson Mandela.
I just wanted to be the first one to take out the ANC. I'm sick and tired. The youth don't work. They have at least 3 degrees with no jobs. If there are jobs, they're given to friends of the ANC.
We are hoping that things will change because our biggest problem, our children are not working. 30 years old, I'm still maintaining a son of 30-something years. He went to university, but no job.
Unemployment is a huge problem in South Africa. Currently, 1 in 3 people are unemployed, and that rate rises to 45% for those aged 15 to 24. South Africa also suffers from a very high crime rate, with an average of 75 people murdered per day. Basic infrastructure is also badly managed. In particular, frequent power cuts mean South Africans suffer from frequent power blackouts. Now, to discuss the elections and the ANC's record in government, I spoke earlier to Andrew Feinstein. Andrew was an MP in the first ANC government before leaving the party in protest at corruption. In 2009, Andrew published a book on his experience in the party called After the Party, Corruption, the ANC and South Africa's Uncertain Future. I started by asking Andrew to explain why it's taken 30 years for the ANC to appear under genuine electoral threat.
I think in any liberation movement, if you look at liberation struggles throughout Africa, it has taken almost a generation for people to even consider other alternatives to the party that was seen as being the liberator. And I think that's the main reason in South Africa. I think in addition to that, it's really important to understand that for many people, the ANC is more than just a liberation movement or a political party. For people who had been involved in the struggle against apartheid, it's almost a home and was a very broad church of people of a huge diversity of political opinions. And so for many people, it was as much a cultural as a political thing. Why that is changing, I just think, when you have a party in power for this length of time, particularly a party that has been bedeviled by huge corruption scandals, by a sense of ineptness in running the state, I think ultimately there comes a time of sort of voter fatigue when the liberation mythology, if you will, actually becomes less important than people's day-to-day lives.
Can you talk about the issue of corruption? I know you were an ANC MP before you left, sort of over a row over corruption. What's the nature of corruption in the ANC? Why does it seem to be so prevalent? What are its consequences?
When I was a member of parliament, I tried to investigate a $10 billion arms deal that Thabo Mbeki had really engineered just as Nelson Mandela was stepping down from office and Mbeki was replacing him. And the main reason for that, about $350 million of bribes, conservatively estimated, were paid. 115 million pounds by BAE Systems, the British company, with the help of Tony Blair and Prince Andrew. This arms deal, in which 40% of the bribes allegedly went to the party itself, was the point at which the ANC really lost its moral compass, the point at which it was okay to use state contracts to benefit the party and key individuals in the party. And this was a huge change from Mandela. And, Mbeki, who was seen as something of a Leninist, very top-down leadership, information on a sort of need-to-know basis, really changed the culture of the way the organization functioned. And a part of that was because we had got our funding from Scandinavian countries, from the former Soviet Union, etc. Those sources had dried up, obviously, as we became a political party. And so we were desperate for ways to fund the party. And an arms deal in an industry that accounts for 40% of all corruption in the world was the way we decided to do it. But what that did was it created a particular culture where it was okay to use the state for patronage, where it was okay to use state contracts to benefit the party. Very different to Mandela, who, of course, had been all about everything being done in the broad national interest, not the party's interest. So I think that was a fundamental step. And that was Mbeki's doing, really. And it was interesting because he was seen as a technocrat, but he was actually a technocrat who undermined good governance through the beginnings of corruption that benefited the party. This was then taken to a completely another level by Jacob Zuma, Mbeki's successor, in a process of what we describe as state capture in South Africa, where the highest office of state and the main institutions of the state are effectively captured for the private benefit of the occupant of that highest office and their business associates, usually. So, think Donald Trump in the United States of America, Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom, similar, but done on an even wider, deeper scale.
Can you talk about the problems in South Africa facing ordinary people? And it may or may not be sort of the result of corruption. So sort of very high unemployment rates, especially for young people, very high crime rates, including a very high murder rate. And then you've also got sort of frequent power cuts, which are very inconvenient for ordinary people, but also makes it very difficult to sort of run an efficient business, which isn't particularly good for the economy. So where do these sort of economic and social problems come from?
Look at the sort of socioeconomic challenges facing South Africa. They all really stem from one thing, and that is extreme economic inequality. So South Africa was always amongst, the three most unequal countries on the planet during the apartheid years. Since apartheid, it's actually become even more unequal and is probably the most unequal country on the planet today, maybe the second most. And that's a consequence of the economy still remaining largely in the white minority's hands, with a very tiny clique of a black elite who are now also big beneficiaries of the sort of crony capitalism that the ANC has. In addition to which, I would argue, and I have to hold my hands up here because, I was part of the government working on economic and finance issues. And we, in those early governments, got it completely wrong in the sense that there was this idea driven by Thabo Mbeki that the so-called Washington consensus, effectively deregulating our economy, opening it up to the global economy very, very quickly and radically, would result in huge amounts of foreign direct investment. And it was this FDI that was going to generate jobs, it was going to generate growth in the economy, et cetera, et cetera. It was undoubtedly the wrong economic policy, in the sense that South Africa had a vast pool of unskilled labor, many of whom were unemployed, many of whom remain unemployed. And a more domestically demand-driven approach in which we protected some of our domestic industries to retain and grow employment would have made a huge difference. So just to give one very quick example, the textile and related industries, which was particularly big in the area that I come from, the Western Cape, around Cape Town, employed about 320, 350,000 people. And when all protection for the industry were lifted literally overnight, the reality is employment in that sector has dwindled to 20 to 30,000 people. So I think our economic model was wrong. In addition to which, you add to that a level of ineptness in day-to-day governance, where people are given senior positions in departments in state-run enterprises because of whom they know rather than because of their skills and competences. So I think these various factors have come together. You know, the other factors that you mentioned, things like the crime rate, the murder rate, these were always a part of apartheid South Africa. The reality is they were just confined to the so-called black townships. And it's only once deracialization took place that crime spread throughout the country, and corruption of the police services has meant that's remained a very serious problem.
As we're sort of saying, this is the first election where the ANC seem as if they won't win or it seems possible that they won't win an absolute majority. Could you talk a bit about the alternatives? If people are turning away from the ANC, who are they turning towards? What are the sort of ideological currents that are also present in South Africa?
The problem with the nature of South African politics is that the ANC itself is multiple parties in one organization. So it has a left wing, a centrist wing, and a conservative wing. And there are other parties that represent elements of that. So there is the historical opposition party called the Democratic Alliance, which was a predominantly white party from the apartheid era that has continued. Its vote has sort of plateaued. It's seen as very much a party that focuses on white interests primarily, and it hasn't been able to break out of that mold. To the left of the ANC, you have something called the Economic Freedom Fighters, which is an interesting organization run by a former president of the ANC Youth League, Julius Malema, very charismatic, very dynamic politician, very bright guy. But again, he supposedly, broke away from the ANC, it discussed with corruption, et cetera, et cetera. But while in the ANC, was a big recipient of corruption during the Jacob Zuma years, and really fell out with Zuma because there was a sort of a ceiling on how much he could accumulate himself in the province that Zuma had said basically he can exploit. So those would be the two main currents. And now for this election, we have literally hundreds of smaller parties emerging. The most popular of which seems to be a party called Rise Mzansi, founded by a newspaper editor who's quite well regarded. It won't do particularly well, but I think they see a sort of a long-term plan of building forward. And I think in addition to votes going to a lot of smaller parties, and of course Jacob Zuma himself has created a party called the MK Party to resonate with the name of South Africa's military, with the ANC's military wing from the liberation days, Umkhonto weSizwe, or MK for short. They look as though they might actually, get sort of 6 to 8% of the vote, which makes them a bit of a player when it comes to coalition building. So if you had to describe the political landscape in South Africa leading into this election, I think the best description would be as fractured. And the key thing after the election, if as expected, the ANC gets somewhere between about 43 to 48% of the vote, will determine the sort of size of party or parties it needs to go into coalition with to continue to govern. And there are going to be all sorts of interesting dynamics. Would they go into coalition with Julius Malema and his Economic Freedom Fighters, who are seen as much more left-wing than themselves? Would they go into coalition with the Democratic Alliance, seen as a predominantly white party, sort of center-rightish? And it's going to be very interesting political choices for President Cyril Ramaphosa. And obviously, there are people both within his cabinet and outside it within the ANC who are poised to try and push him out if, for instance, he favors going the center-right route. The current deputy president, a chap called Paul Mashatile, is much closer to the Economic Freedom Fighters and might say, well, I'll come into the presidency and make a deal with Julius Malema, who we need to invite back into the ANC. So I think there are going to be a lot of interesting dynamics immediately after the vote and once we know what the outcome is.
And I suppose, finally, I mean, we've talked about so many of the problems which are afflicting South Africa: unemployment, power cuts, crime. I mean, is there any way you can look at this election and sort of see that, maybe it's the start of a recovery for South Africa? Is sort of, are there any of these smaller parties that could go into coalition with the ANC who might try and sort out corruption or sort out unemployment or sort out the electricity system? Is there sort of an avenue you can see towards prosperity, I suppose?
I suppose the first point to make, and it's really important to understand this, that South Africa under the ANC, which has had many challenges, is so profoundly and fundamentally better than anything it was before 1994, obviously. But a racist oligarchy that oppresses the vast majority of people is a fairly low bar. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. The fact that South Africa is such a dynamic democracy is really a testament to the country's transition. The fact that interracial violence or tensions are not a focus of this election in any meaningful way is a huge positive for the country. To be honest with you, Michael, my analysis is that South African politics will only start to change fundamentally in a very positive way that will entrench our democracy, that will lead to real practical solutions from the myriad of problems that you've identified that confront us, and of course, confront poorer South Africans in much more direct and immediate ways than the well-off in the country, is if the ANC itself actually physically fractures into multiple parties. I see this as the only way in which we are going to see there being a political spectrum in the country with different parties fighting for different ideas that would have meaningful differences, a left party, a center party, and a sort of a center-right party. So I don't think that's going to happen as a consequence of this election. I think this election might be one step towards that ultimate requirement, but it is still going to be a while before we see this fracture, depending on the outcome, the way in which the ANC tries to forge coalitions, and how successful those coalitions are in governing, which I think will be moderately successful, not very successful at all, will determine the speed of that ultimate fracture of the ANC into significant different parties.
That was Andrew Feinstein speaking to me earlier today on those historic South African elections. The results will be in over the weekend. As I said at the start of the show, Andrew Feinstein, not only an expert on South African politics and a former ANC member, but also standing as an independent against Keir Starmer in Holborn and St Pancras. Very, very interesting man. Israel has run an almost decade-long secret campaign against the International Criminal Court. The country's intelligence agencies have surveilled, hacked, and allegedly even threatened senior ICC staff in an attempt to derail the court's investigation into alleged war crimes committed in Palestine. That's according to an investigation jointly conducted by The Guardian and Israel's 972 magazine, which has revealed Israel's 9-year war on the ICC. Now, the story starts in 2015. That's when Palestine was granted membership of the International Criminal Court. That meant that, for the first time, the court had a clear jurisdiction to investigate potential war crimes committed against the Palestinian people. The ICC prosecutor at the time was Gambian lawyer Fatou Bensouda, who decided to open a non-criminal investigation into what the court called, quote, the situation in Palestine. The Guardian reports that just a month later, this happened. 2 men who had managed to obtain the prosecutor's private address turned up at her home in The Hague. Sources familiar with the incident said the men declined to identify themselves when they arrived, but said they wanted to hand-deliver a letter to Bensouda on behalf of an unknown German woman who wanted to thank her. The envelope contained hundreds of dollars in cash and a note with an Israeli phone number. Sources with knowledge of an ICC review into the incident said that while it was not possible to identify the men or fully establish their motives, it was concluded that Israel was likely to be signalling to the prosecutor that it knew where she lived. This is the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. And you've got a situation whereby the ICC, their internal review, has judged this was to let her know that Israel knew where she lived. One of the most, senior legal professionals in the world, quite frankly, the chief prosecutor at the ICC. Meanwhile, within Israel, the Prime Minister's National Security Council mobilized a response to the ICC investigation. Two Israeli intelligence officials told The Guardian that Benjamin Netanyahu took a personal interest in their monitoring of the court's officials. So they described him as being, quote, obsessed with Intercept shedding light on the court's activities. 5 sources familiar with the Israeli intelligence service told The Guardian it routinely monitored communications between the court and Palestinians. Now, The Guardian reports this. Thanks to their comprehensive access to Palestinian telecoms infrastructure, the sources said, intelligence operatives could capture the calls without installing spyware on the ICC officials' devices. If Fatou Bensouda spoke to any person in the West Bank or Gaza, then that phone call would enter Intercept systems, one source said. Another said there was no hesitation internally over spying on the prosecutor, adding, with Bensouda, she's black and African, so who cares? Now, so much stands out from that. They can intercept any communication that goes in or out. So this is the Israelis can intercept any communication that goes in or out of Palestine. This is the people they're occupying. Any conversation that any Palestinian ever has, over a phone call, can be listened to by Israel. That in itself is outrageous. Then you've got them intercepting, as I say, one of the most senior legal professionals in the world. And then this quote, with Bensouda, she's black and African, so who cares? Right? Now, this is someone reporting on the attitudes within the Israeli Secret Service. This is not sort of a direct quote from someone within the Israeli Civil Service. This is someone sort of commenting on other people's attitudes. It's sort of a paraphrase, probably, of people there. But this is phenomenal to treat the International Criminal Court in this way. In 2019, Fatou Bensouda announced that she believed there was a reasonable basis for opening a criminal investigation into war crimes committed by Israeli officials against Palestinians. The Guardian reports that it was at this point that Bensouda received personal threats. They included approaches from Yossi Cohen, the then director of Israel's intelligence agency, Mossad. He was already a figure familiar to Bensouda, having tried to persuade her not to open the criminal investigation. But once Bensouda had made that decision, Cohen's attempt to influence the chief prosecutor allegedly became more intense. The Guardian reports this. Cohen persisted in contacting the prosecutor, turning up unannounced and subjecting her to unwanted calls. While initially amicable, the sources said Cohen's behavior became increasingly threatening and intimidating. Accounts of his secret meetings with Bensouda paint a picture in which he sought to build a relationship with the prosecutor as he attempted to dissuade her from pursuing an investigation that, if it went ahead, could embroil senior Israeli officials. 3 sources briefed on Cohen's activities said they understood the spy chief had tried to recruit Bensouda into complying with Israel's demands during the period in which she was waiting for a ruling from the pre-trial chamber. They said he became more threatening after he began to realize the prosecutor would not be persuaded to abandon the investigation. At one stage, Cohen is said to have made comments about Bensouda's security and thinly veiled threats about the consequences for her career if she proceeded. Wow. It goes on to say this. When she was prosecutor, Bensouda formally disclosed her encounters with Cohen to a small group within the ICC with the intention of putting on record her belief that she had been personally threatened. Sources familiar with the disclosures said. Now, this reminds me of the mafia, right? So I'm not an expert on Italian politics, but sort of you often read stories, I'm not sure if it still goes on, of you'd have a prosecutor who would be, looking into high-level corruption by the mafia, potentially sort of connections between the mafia and political leaders, and that prosecutor would get assassinated, right? And then obviously, that would completely disrupt the court case, but also it would terrify anyone from sort of mounting a case against the mafia. A very effective intimidation tactic where you say, well, one, we'll either sort of buy off politicians so that they don't prosecute us and so we can sort of get away with our crimes, or if it does seem like someone is getting somewhere, if we can't control them, we will threaten them. And if threatening them is not enough, they'll assassinate them. And obviously, Fatou Bensouda was not assassinated. There's no suggestion there was a plot to do so. But this sort of bullying tactics of a prosecutor, that is mafia style, right? The Guardian also reports that Israel tried to mount a diplomatic smear campaign against members of Bensouda's family. So they write this. According to multiple sources, the Mossad had obtained a cache of material, including transcripts of an apparent sting operation against Bensouda's husband. The origins of the material and whether it was genuine remain unclear. However, elements of the information were circulated by Israel among Western diplomatic officials, sources said, in a failed attempt to discredit the chief prosecutor. This is an absolutely extraordinary story from The Guardian and 972. Right, so you always have these sort of Israeli plotters, of course we respect international law, but the ICC is anti-Semitic, they're coming after us. Now, it turns out when the ICC sort of had the balls to sort of say, we will seriously look at what you're doing in Palestine, they didn't send sort of a lawyer to argue the case, say, okay, no, we're happy, we're happy to stand up in court. We've always maintained that we are the most humanitarian army in the world, and so we will go and defend ourselves in front of these judges. No, they're trying to intimidate these judges, both with sort of potential implicit physical threats, and then by trying to source information on their family members. This is really, really, abusive behavior. This is a rogue state. And Bensouda left the ICC in 2021, shortly after announcing a full criminal investigation into Israel's conduct in Palestine. In June of 2021, Karim Khan took over as prosecutor. Earlier this month, Khan announced that he would be seeking warrants for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel's Defense Secretary Yoav Gallant. And he added this.
And I insist that all attempts to impede, to intimidate, or to improperly influence the officials of this court cease immediately. My office will not hesitate to act pursuant to the provisions of Article 70 of the Rome Statute if such conduct continues and persists.
So I think when most people sort of heard that initial statement from Karim Khan, they would have read that as meaning sort of diplomatic intimidation. You sort of got Netanyahu sort of standing up and speaking to cameras and saying, well, the ICC chief prosecutor, he must be an anti-Semite. And that is intimidating behavior, right? But after reading this report, you think, is he talking about a more base, sort of more explicit, more direct level of intimidation, which is threats to his security, threats to his family, right? There haven't been, as far as I understand, sort of any leaks or reporting on threats made to the current chief prosecutor. But if this is what they did to his predecessor, you can see why he might be there saying, we will not be subjected to intimidation. Maybe he is already being subjected to intimidation. That seems to be the modus operandi of the Israeli state. So this idea, and then you don't have sort of all the members of the upstanding international community sort of saying this is completely outrageous. We stand behind the ICC. You've got essentially, the United States saying they don't have jurisdiction. They shouldn't be doing this anyway. The Israelis sort of standing up in public and saying they're all anti-Semitic. That can be the only reason they care about the war crimes we're committing. And who knows what's going on behind the scenes. I'm contacted by The Guardian. Former Mossad chief Yossi Cohen did not respond to requests for comment, and former ICC prosecutor Fatou Bensouda declined to comment as well. But really important report. I do recommend you go and read that directly. Let's wrap up there. That's all for us. Thank you for joining me as ever. This show will be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.